So to start off with, this is one of the original rams, and it's literally for show. It doesn't do anything. We can pull that out, and it's just showing a tube, a hollow tube. But that is a good size for these T6 lead screws. So these lead screws will actually run up inside. So they fit nicely up inside there. But to get the ram working as an operational ram, we got to mount these motors, mount the screw thread onto the end of the motors, and then these are the nuts that come with the screw threads. So you can see that these are T6, I believe they're 2mm. Let me think. No, they're more than that. I would say with a 6mm lead, and that's determined on this here. So one complete turn will push the screw through about 6mm. So that's the movement determined. So these N20 motors, these have a 200 RPM output shaft speed, and that's determined by the little gearbox that's inside. So we've got to kind of piece it all together. Now I've taken the end cap off of the outer portion of the ram. So these are the basic components. Now we have got a 10mm bore down inside, but with the manufacturing process in these plastic things, it's never round and it seems to be tapered. Taking a 10mm drill bit, putting it down, you see it will go in so far and then stop. So these need running through, so that we've got a parallel bore. They've got to be done quite carefully because we've got a fairly thin wall there, and you could split the seam that's running down there. So I tend to clamp this in a vise and then hand bore by turning this around gently, using plenty of silicone oil until it emerges out the other side, then run it through the other side and back through, so that we've got more or less a tapered hole. Then even once this bore has been bored out, it's still too small for these, which means we've got to shave down a little bit of the outside wall, take this flange off to leave us just a barrel, really, a parallel barrel, and then that will eventually fit onto the end of that, so that will be glued on. So we need to bore some of that thread out for it to be 7mm, and 7mm will allow this outer sleeve to pass through, so that will be glued on the end. So if we imagine that on the end of that turned down to fit inside this barrel, we're more or less back to standard. So what we do to get the movement is to attach the screw thread, which will pass down inside there, and then with that attached like that onto the end of that, then as we turn the spindle or the T6 lead screw, it extends out. So the motor will be attached to the anchor point, which would be there somewhere, and the moving part will be attached to there. What we're going to do first is to looking at the end of the motor, and we can see, hopefully we can focus in on that, but we've got a D-shaped shaft, so we've got to bore a hole in the end of this 3mm hole. Then we've got to bore a 1.6 hole somewhere near the end. You can see that the bore in the middle will allow the T6 lead screw to sit over the top, and then we use a tiny grub screw that's on the end of that thing. So we've got to thread the hole. It goes through the side. So it's the M2 tap, thread tap. And then once that's hole through the side and the hole's bored down the end, that will fit on there, and then the grub screw will screw through and lock this to the end of the motor shaft. We definitely need a lathe to do this, because obviously if you get any run out, you're gonna be doing that, and the screw thread is going to try and do that inside of this, and there's a bit of clearance in there. It's not going to tolerate too much run out, so it's got to be done in a lathe, so precision work. So the first thing then is to bore a hole in the end, and I'll put a piece of heat shrink over the thread so that I can clamp this in the jaws of the lathe tight enough to get a good grip on it without bruising the thread, because I don't want to bruise that. I've got nothing to chase the thread out if it gets damaged. So that's the first thing to do, is to put a heat shrink on that tube, shrink it down, then clamp it in the vise, in the chuck, and then I'll run a counter, what they call it, a centering drill down the middle of it, and that's ×2. Alright, so first phase of the operation. I've now got the heat shrink onto the threads, so these are ready to go into the vise. The reason that I use heat shrink is it gives a good layer, but there's no end. If you try to use something like masking tape, the tape at some point has got to overlap over the top. Well, you'll get a run out of your centre, the thickness of the tape. So with this you can heat shrink down and you've got no seam to avoid, so it's the same thickness around the whole diameter, as it were. So I've left a little bit overhanging or protruding through, so I can put these in the chuck and drill out the centre core, take them out of the chuck and do the second operation, which is the drilling on the side, which I'll be doing by hand. So right, let's go over to the lathe. Alright, so we're all ready for op 1. Here we go. Okay, so now we're ready. We'll bore them out with 3mm. So I've got the 3mm in there, ready to go. Little drop of oil. Okay, let's hit it. Okay, so we've got the motor I'm just going to offer it in. Yeah, that's a nice fit. We've got that part of the operation done. We can remove this now. Zoom inside. Now you can see here the pressure marks of where the chuck is actually clamped down onto that, and you can see that this is actually triangular shaped. So hold him in the light a minute, and we can see the bore down the middle, right down the centre. So that one's done. Now we'll do the same operation with the other rod. The next part of the process is to attach this spindle onto the shaft, the output shaft of the N20 motor. So this is the second drilling operation to attach these two bits. So we've already done the first operation by boring a hole down the centre of the shaft there, and that will sit nicely on the end of the N20 motor shaft. We've got a D-shaped drive on the end of that. If I try and zoom in on that, you'll see that it's got a flat on it, so that gives something for it to bite onto. So what I've done is to drill a hole in the side of the T6 shaft and threaded it. So it's an M2 thread, and I use a M2 grub screw to screw through and bear down on the flat of the motor, the shaft of the motor. So that way we've got a direct drive from the motor through the little gearbox out to the shaft, output shaft. So the next process is drilling a hole in the side. There you go. Okay, so I've had a couple more shots with the centre pot just to give me a little bit of a start with the drill. That's it, we're through. So that we've got the hole bored in the side of it. The next part of the operation is the threading. So the threading, 1.5 is pretty good for a 2mm thread. It makes it a little bit tighter, but yeah, it's okay. Just do it by hand, go in gentle with it, feel it. When it starts to do the cutting, just make sure everything's lined up properly. Don't screw it all the way through, just get him started.